Welcome to EduRev.
Welcome students. I'm Clarice Pereira Colasso and I have been training NEET medical aspirants in botany and zoology as well as NCERT based boards for the past 8 years. So today we will start with our first chapter of our class 12 syllabus, and that is reproduction in organisms. Now, reproduction in organisms will be divided into many subparts. Today we will start with the first set. Okay, so that will include 3 subtopics. The first is an introduction to reproduction. Now, in this introduction to reproduction, we will study about the various types of reproduction and what is the purpose of reproduction. Then we will move on to the first type of reproduction, that is asexual reproduction. And finally, we will study asexual reproduction in depth, in which we will study the various types of asexual reproduction. Now, the first thing in reproduction that we need to understand, okay, is what is the lifespan of an individual. So say suppose if you are asked, what is your lifespan? Obviously, the lifespan of an individual refers to the time period from when you are born to the time period when you die. Now, naturally, when we refer to death, we are referring to natural death rather than accidental death. So lifespan is defined as the period from birth to natural death of the organism. Now, the next question that we can think about is, does the lifespan of an individual depend on his or her size? Does it depend on the organism size? Okay, now for example, maybe we would take an ant. Now, an ant being small, we may say that the lifespan is really short. Whereas if we take an elephant, we may say that the lifespan is really long. However, we need to understand that the size of the organism does not really define what is its lifespan. For example, if you take a crow and you take a parrot, they're more or less comparatively the same size. However, you will see that a crow will live at the max for 15 years, whereas parrots, certain species, not all of them, but certain species would live even up to say 140 years. Okay, so definitely the lifespan of an organism does not necessarily correlate with its size. There is no necessary correlation between them. Now, we need to understand if any organism is immortal. Okay, now nice to be immortal, but is any organism immortal? Are human beings immortal? Now, there are certain organisms that are immortal. Yes, they are. Okay, but those organisms are only unicellular organisms. So maybe a unicellular prokaryote, that is bacteria, or a unicellular eukaryote, and those are your protists. Now, why is it that unicellular organisms tend to become immortal? Now, for that, let's use a simple example. Here I have with us the figure of amoeba. Okay, an amoeba undergoing binary fission, undergoing cell division. Now, on top here, you can see that this is the parent cell. The parent cell undergoes reproduction to give you 2 daughter cells. Okay, however, you can see that when the parent gives rise to 2 daughter cells, can I say that the parent exists in the daughter and the parent has never really died? There is no death or natural cell death of the parent. The parent exists in the daughter cells. Therefore, we say that unicellular organisms, prokaryotes as well as eukaryotes, are said to be immortal. Now, coming to what reproduction is, how would we define reproduction? Okay, so reproduction is simply defined as a biological process. It's a natural process, okay, in which an organism will give rise to young ones, maybe one young one or many, and these young ones have to be similar to itself. Okay, now what is the purpose of reproduction? You will understand as we go through these chapters that reproduction is intrinsically part of every individual. Okay, it belongs to every individual's lifespan, every individual's biological process. So why is it that reproduction is so intrinsic to our nature? And the answer is very simple. We need to reproduce simply so that our species is able to continue. Okay, so the purpose of reproduction is simply the continuity of your species. Okay, generation after generation. Now, coming to the types of reproduction. Now, we have 2 types of reproduction, but these 2 types of reproduction are divided. So you have 2 different types based on the number of parents involved. Okay, now in the first case, you will find that 1 parent is involved, but in the second case, you will find that 2 parents need to be involved. For example, when we say asexual reproduction, now asexual implies lack of sexuality in that sense, differentiation of sexuality. Okay, so asexual reproduction is defined as reproduction when organisms are produced using a single parent, just one parent, okay, with or without the involvement of gametes. Now, the second part of this definition, that is with or without the involvement of gametes, is very well understood in some latter chapters. Okay, we will not deal too much with it at the moment. But with or without the involvement of gametes, very simple understanding is how a drone is formed in case of honeybees. Okay, so I'm just giving you a hint at the moment. But we're going to focus on the first part. Asexual reproduction involves just a single parent. But when we consider sexual reproduction, sexuality, okay, so when we consider sexual reproduction, it is a type of reproduction that occurs when two parents are involved, and these two parents must be of opposite sex, okay, so one male, the other one female, and they will participate in the reproductive process by fusion of male and female gametes. So this is intrinsic to sexual reproduction. Now, for today's class, we are going to focus on asexual reproduction, the first type of reproduction. Now, before we go into asexual reproduction, let's try to understand how does an organism choose between asexual and sexual. Okay, now as you're studying, you will understand very soon that there are certain organisms that can undergo asexual as well as sexual. Now the question is, when would it choose asexual and when would it choose sexual? Okay, now there are three different criteria that define the choice of reproduction. The first is, what is the habitat? Okay, now for example, suppose if you have a habitat that has favorable conditions, okay, so let's say a proper watery environment, maybe if you need for the organism to survive. So whenever you have favorable conditions, asexual reproduction is probably favored. But let's say a dry climate is setting in, a really dry, hot weather is setting in. Okay, now that same organism, because it is facing unfavorable conditions, may choose to go into a sexual type of reproduction. Now the question is, when, or rather why, does an organism try to shift between asexual and sexual? And the understanding is simply this. In asexual reproduction, since you are formed directly from one parent, okay, you lack variation. That means you're very similar to your parent, you lack a different form, you lack genetic variation. Okay. However, in sexual reproduction, since at least two parents are going to be involved here and gametes are going to fuse, certain amount of variation is going to be present, and variation gives you a degree of difference. Okay, and that particular degree of difference will help you to evolve or sustain yourself in those unfavorable conditions. Okay, so the first criteria that defines the type of reproduction is the organism's habitat. The second is the internal physiology. For example, if you are probably, let's say, you are not very well defined as a cell, maybe you're a prokaryotic cell, definitely you would prefer asexual reproduction because you're not very complex in your nature. But say suppose if your internal physiology is very, very complicated, then it is most likely that you will have sexual reproduction. So internal physiology. And finally, other factors. Now, what are these other random factors? Okay, now the other random factors are mainly your genetic nature. Is your other number of genes, is the amount of DNA that you have very complex or very simple? If it is complex, most likely you will have sexual reproduction. If it is not very complex, quite simple, most likely you will have asexual reproduction. Okay, so the choice of reproduction is based on three things: organism's habitat, the internal physiology, and finally the genetic nature. Now, coming to asexual reproduction. Now we have said that just one parent is required here, okay, and very often you are asked to compare asexual reproduction to cloning. Okay, now for that matter, let's try to understand what is a clone really. Now to define a clone, an individual must satisfy two criteria. The first, the individuals must be morphologically similar. Now what do you mean by morphology? Your external look. Okay, so the two individuals that are clones must look similar on the exterior surface, and they must also be genetically similar, which means internally they should also be similar in terms of their genes, the type of genes, the amount of DNA, how that DNA is going to be expressed. So all of that has to be the same. Okay, so a clone is defined as an individual that is morphologically similar as well as genetically similar. Both criteria must be satisfied. Now, the question asked here is, does asexual reproduction result in clones? Now, you can think about it. If you're directly forming from your parent, obviously you will result in the formation of clones. So the answer is yes, asexual reproduction does introduce clones. Now why? Because the offspring are not only identical, so they are identical to one another. So maybe say like twins, okay? So they're identical to one another, but they are exact copies of their parent. They don't look at all anything different from their parent, okay? So morphologically they're the same with respect to their parent, as well as genetically they are the same with respect to their parent. So yes, asexual reproduction does result in the formation of clones. Now, what are the various types of asexual reproduction? Now here we have a whole list of them. In total, there are around 6 various types of asexual reproduction. That is fission, budding, spore formation or sporulation, regeneration, fragmentation. Now often we make a mistake between regeneration and fragmentation, so I'm going to try to explain that to you here. And finally, vegetative propagation. Okay, so let's go to the first type of asexual reproduction, the simplest of all, and that is fission. Now, fission is actually of 2 types. One is called binary fission and the other is called multiple fission. Now, what is the meaning of this? Fission basically means that the parent body divides to give rise to offspring directly, okay? And the amount of cytoplasm is almost equally distributed amongst the daughter cells. Now, when we say binary fission, the word binary tells us 2, okay? Bi implies 2. So here, binary fission would imply that the parent divides to give us 2 daughter cells. However, multiple fission should therefore imply that the parent should give rise to many daughter cells. Okay, so what's important in binary is that the number of daughter cells are just 2, but in multiple, the number of daughter cells are going to be many. Now, when does binary fission occur and when does multiple fission occur? Now, you'll find certain organisms, let's say for example, amoeba. Amoeba can undergo binary fission, but amoeba can also undergo multiple fission. So when does amoeba show you binary and when does amoeba show you multiple? Okay, now you will see that binary fission is very often found when you have favorable conditions. Okay, so the favorable condition favors formation of 2. However, unfavorable condition favors the formation of many, multiple fission. Okay, now let's go to a couple of examples here. So binary fission, very common in bacteria, so Monera, and very common in protistants, okay, like amoeba and paramecium. So here you have the parent cell, parent amoeboid, okay. So this is amoeba. You can see that the amount of cytoplasm is quite a lot here. Then as the cell keeps on, you can see the nucleus then starting to divide, okay. And then you can finally see the 2 daughter cells at the end here. You can see 2 daughter cells. So this is a very, very characteristic example of binary fission. A single parent giving rise to 2 daughters. However, let's look at multiple fission. Okay, now multiple fission can occur in bacteria, it can occur in protistants, but mainly in protistants we're going to study about amoeba and we're going to study about plasmodium. Okay, and these are 2 very important examples as we carry forward, so you need to remember this really well. Now in multiple fission, the first thing that you can see is encystment of the parent. Okay, so this is the parent cell, encystment. Now why encystment? Simply because you have unfavorable conditions setting in, so the parent has to be protected. Then you will see that within the cyst, the parent will start dividing to give a whole lot of daughter cells, so multiple fission is occurring. Okay, now you need to understand that this particular cyst will rupture and the daughters will be released if and only if unfavorable conditions change into favorable ones. Okay, now many daughter cells are given out during multiple fission. Now the question is, why does multiple fission occur when you have unfavorable conditions? And the logic is this: if I have many daughter cells, okay, and unfavorable conditions are slowly changing into favorable conditions, remember, still there is some amount of unfavorable condition at that point of time. We can assume that if many daughter cells are present, maybe many of them would still die, but at least a couple of them would survive. So that's the logic behind having multiple fission when unfavorable conditions persist for a long period of time. Now, the next type of reproduction is budding. Now, budding is a little different from fission. Why so? When we spoke about fission, we said that the parent cell divides to give you 2 daughters, and the 2 daughters are more or less equal in their cytoplasm. However, when we speak about budding, okay, the daughter cell that is produced as an outgrowth. Okay, it's just kind of pulled out from the parent cell. There's no real division in that particular sense. It's pulled out from the parent cell, and the daughter is usually a little smaller than the original parent. Okay, so here you can see it is a type of asexual reproduction in which outgrowths, generally unequal outgrowths, are formed either on the inner side of the parent body or on the outer side. So let's try to understand what they mean by inner side and outer side. Okay, now budding can be divided into two. Say suppose the bud is formed on the outer side, I will call it as external budding or exogenous budding. So buds are formed exogenously. Whereas if the bud is formed on the inner side of the body, I will call it as internal budding or endogenous budding. So buds are formed endogenously, inward. Okay, so let's go into both of them in depth and why and when would they occur. Now here again, external budding occurring generally during favorable conditions, internal budding occurring generally during unfavorable conditions. Okay, and a couple of examples for us. For example, for external budding, we have yeast, we have hydra. For internal budding, we have got sponges, that's your porifera. Okay, now external budding. If you look very closely at the figure here, this is your parent cell. Okay, and from the parent cell you have a small bud being extruded outward. Okay, a little bit of cytoplasm moving over there into the bud, and then you can see that the bud has closed. Okay, so very clearly you can see that now this parent cell divides to give you the first daughter cell, and this is the next daughter cell. So we can say that the new bud is formed is definitely going to be smaller than the original parent, and the two cells are no ways similar in terms of quantity of cytoplasm. In terms of quantity and quality of genetic material, they have to be the same. But in terms of cytoplasm, it is lesser. The bud will be lesser. Okay. Now here you can see in yeast the division is unequal and small buds are produced that remain attached initially to the parent and then they can be separated out. When they separate out, they will behave as a new yeast cell. So this is exogenous budding. Another example of exogenous budding apart from yeast we said is hydra. So here you can see the hydra main body, okay, and you can definitely see the bud protruding out here. Now let's focus on internal budding. Now if you look at internal budding, the example that we're going to use is porifera, your sponges. Okay. Now sponges have a particular cell called as archaeocytes. Now during unfavorable conditions, the porifera body, okay, gives a little bit of its body material, that being spicules and spines. Okay. So all of that forms a ball or a cluster around this archaeocyte. And when it does, this particular archaeocyte starts undergoing internal bud formation called as gemmules. Okay. And here you can see the protective body coat on the outside forming from the original body. Now, these gemmules will keep on dividing, you'll keep on having multiple bud formation within this cavity. Okay, and as unfavorable conditions start converting into favorable conditions, through this opening called as the micropyle opening on the top, you can see kind of a circular opening. Okay, the gemmules will ultimately be released. Right, so this is internal budding. Example is in case of sponges, porifera. So buds are endogenously produced, generally seen during unfavorable conditions. Now coming to the third type, that is fragmentation. Now fragmentation and regeneration are often confused, so I need you to understand this very well. Okay. Now the example of fragmentation that we are going to use is Spirogyra. You have studied this probably right from your school level. Okay, and let's look at the technical definition of fragmentation. So here the parent body breaks up into two or more fragments. I think we can agree with that if we look at the figure. This is the parent body consisting of a huge filament, a long filament, number of cells in it, and this particular parent body breaks up into two fragments, one on top, one below. Now each fragment develops into an organism. Now this is where we try, or rather we tend to get confused, okay, with this term. Each fragment develops into an organism. Now if I say each fragment develops into an organism, it implies that this top fragment must undergo certain amount of development, only then it becomes an organism. And this particular fragment below should also undergo certain development, only after which it will be called as a new organism. Okay, so technically speaking, now these are the technical definitions, but in the literal sense, what really is fragmentation? Okay, we'll just redefine it for our own convenience. So fragmentation, okay, each body fragment does not have to develop, but each body fragment resembles a new organism. Now let's try to understand it in this form. So if this is the parent here, this long filament is the parent, you divide to give you one fragment on top and you've divided to give you a second fragment below, which means the top fragment resembles or is a new organism. So can I say this top fragment, just by the fact of breaking away from the original parent, behaves or is already a new organism, and the one down here, okay, also behaves or is a new organism. So no extra development actually has to take place for these individual fragments to become new organisms. Okay, so that is fragmentation. The moment the filament divides, the two cells as they stand, or the two smaller filaments as they stand, are already new organisms. Now, in that respect, let's try to understand what's regeneration. Now, in case of regeneration, we're going to study about planaria. Okay, now let's look at the technical definition. Formation of a full body from a small fragment. Now, what does that mean? It means that from a small fragment, I need to form all body tissues. Now, let's go a little bit further. Okay, so let's say that this is a planaria here, okay, and we have divided planaria into three parts. So the head, a midsection, and a tail. Okay, now if it were fragmentation, I would say that the head, the moment the head broke off from the rest of the body, the head itself is an organism. The midsection again is an organism, and the tail itself is an organism. No extra development was required to make them functional. They are already new organisms. That's fragmentation. But in regeneration, it says that formation of a full body from a small fragment. Now, what does that mean? If I gave you, maybe say, the head or the midsection, from there, I need to regenerate the parts that are missing. Okay. For example, suppose if I give you the midsection. Okay. From the midsection, I need to develop the head as well as the tail. Only then does it become a full body. Okay. Likewise, if I consider the head and the tail sections, I would have to develop, in case of the head, I would have to develop the midsection as well as the tail. In case of the tail, I would have to develop the head and the midsection. So further tissue has to be added to the small fragment that is given to you. Otherwise, no organism really exists. Okay, so that's regeneration. In regeneration, every small part, okay, or rather to every small part, you have to add a lot of tissue. Only after which it starts becoming functional, okay, and it starts behaving as a new organism. However, in fragmentation, the moment it's split, the split products itself were new organisms. So that is the difference between fragmentation, and that's the difference between regeneration. So I hope you have understood these two parts, because this is somewhere where we tend to make mistakes very, very often. So students, I hope you have enjoyed this first lecture. Okay, and we will continue in the next class with the other types of asexual reproduction, as well as we will go a little more in depth into sexual reproduction, the phases of sexual reproduction. So I invite you actually to go through all the material that we have in EduRev Infinity. Okay, it will help you prepare for your NEET exams. We have a variety of question papers, tests. Okay, a lot of material prepared by expert educators in NEET. Also, by subscribing just once to EduRev Infinity, you would have access to the entire subject content, so that is physics, chemistry, as well as biology. And I'm sure by doing this, by going through EduRev Infinity, you will increase and definitely have a better nationwide ranking. So I thank you, students, for attending today's class, and I look forward to seeing you for the next class. Thank you.